Thank you very much, Connie. And it is so encouraging to see so many people here tonight. You have restored our faith that there are enough people who care about the future of our country. The media have already designated the front runners for the Republican nomination for president, and they're working overtime to force Republicans to line up behind one of them right now. The Republican National Convention won't take place until next September. Most people I know are still shopping. We've listened to several presidential debates organized by the networks, but tonight I'd like to set forth what we want to know from a candidate worthy of our backing on some of the issues that were ignored or not adequately covered by those network debates. First of all, respect for life. It is definitely not enough for a candidate to say, I'm pro-life. It's not sufficient to say he believes Roe v. Wade should be overturned because the president has no power to do that. We want to know what the candidate will do as president to advance protection for unborn babies. We want him to promise to veto the Freedom of Choice Act, for which the feminists, led by Senator Barbara Boxer, have just started an all-out campaign. The Freedom of Choice Act would prohibit government at any level from interfering with our efforts to protect human life. The Freedom of Choice Act would wipe out every single pro-life bill we've passed in the last 34 years, including parental notice, parental consent, the woman's right to know law, waiting periods, fetal homicide, abortion funding restrictions, and partial birth abortion bans. We must have certain knowledge that our candidate would veto any such law. We want sure knowledge that our candidate would veto any bill that would allow or fund embryonic stem cell research. We must be assured that he will sign a bill to prohibit human cloning through somatic cell nuclear transfer or any other means. And we want our candidate to pledge to support retention of the same identical pro-life plank that has been in the Republican Party platform through the last 6 Republican National Conventions. That plank proclaims the unborn child has a fundamental individual right to life which cannot be infringed. Second is respect for traditional marriage. It's not enough for our candidate to say, I oppose same-sex marriage. Even John Kerry said that. It's not enough to say, I support a marriage amendment. The president doesn't have any role in adopting constitutional amendments. We want to know how our candidate, if he becomes president, will use the power of his office to protect traditional marriage between a man and a woman. We want him to promise to use his executive power to fully enforce the Defense of Marriage Act, called DOMA, which the GAO says covers 1,138 federal laws affecting the rights of husbands and wives, including many regulations in the Income Tax Code and the Social Security system. We want our candidate to promise to sign legislation that would prohibit federal judges from ordering same-sex marriage or domestic partner benefits like those that accrue to married couples, either by pretending that it is required by the 14th Amendment or by declaring DOMA unconstitutional. Third, we're concerned about protection for parents' rights. We want our presidential candidate to protect parents' rights in public schools by repudiating the offensive and impudent Ninth Circuit Court decision in Fields versus Palmdale, which ruled that parents' fundamental right to control the upbringing of their children does not extend beyond the threshold of the school door. Since the federal government gives about $60 billion a year to public schools, we want our candidate to promise to sign school appropriation bills only if they contain language to protect parents' rights to protect their children against such things as nosy questionnaires about sex, drugs, and suicide, mental health screening, forcing children to be put on psychotropic drugs, courses that promote Islam or homosexuality, bilingual education, classroom materials that parents consider pornographic, giving birth control to 6th grade girls without parental knowledge or consent, and sex education and sexual orientation courses, even if they are masquerading as diversity courses. Fourth is our opposition to supremacist judges. It's not enough for our candidate to say he will appoint strict constructionist judges. We want our president to appoint only judges and justices who will promise to enforce the Constitution as it is written. We want our president to appoint only judges and justices who publicly reject the liberal notion that our Constitution is evolving, or that decisions can be based on emerging awareness about morals. Our presidential candidate must promise to appoint judges who will stand up against the organized campaign to banish acknowledgement of God from every public school, building, and park, turning the United States into a secular or even atheist nation. We want our presidential candidate to endorse and promise to sign legislation, such as the We the People bill, to withdraw power from federal judges to ban the Pledge of Allegiance and the Ten Commandments from public schools and public places. We want our candidate to repeat the best thing that President George W. Bush ever said, and I quote, "We will not stand for judges who undermine democracy by legislating from the bench and try to remake the culture of America by court order." Fifth, we want our president to stop illegal aliens from entering our country. We want our candidate for president to announce that he considers it a presidential duty to prevent illegal entry into our country. We want him to be forthright in praising the American people for successfully demanding that the U.S. Senate defeat the Bush-Kennedy amnesty bill earlier this year. We want our candidate to promise us he will never try to bamboozle us with a similar so-called comprehensive immigration bill that includes amnesty for millions of illegals now in our country. We want our candidate to reject any bill that would bring into our country hundreds of thousands more aliens who are falsely called guest workers, most of whom have never been to high school and will take jobs from our own millions of high school dropouts who desperately need entry-level, low-paid jobs to start building their lives. We want our presidential candidate to keep the lid on the multinationals' attempt to bring in thousands more foreigners on H-1B visas who take jobs from our college graduates, especially our engineers and computer specialists. We want to hear our candidate's plan for getting the guest workers already here to leave when their visas expire. We want our candidate to tell us how he will lift the tax burden that Americans suffer today in providing the net value of $20,000 a year to every illegal alien household. That figures from the Heritage Foundation. We want our candidate to tell us exactly what he will do to prevent the entry of the 85% of illegal drugs that come over our southern border. We want our candidate to enforce the law against employers hiring illegal aliens. The illegals and foreigners on visas are paid less than Americans, so they depress American wages. We want our candidate to reject George W. Bush's plan called totalization, which would put illegal aliens into our Social Security system. We want our candidate to build the 854-mile fence that the secure fence law requires. We want our candidate to pardon border guards Ignacio Ramos and Jose Campion, who are unjustly imprisoned for intercepting a professional Mexican drug smuggler. And we want our candidate to stop the entry of Mexican trucks on our highways and roads. Even Bill Clinton kept them out. Sixth, we want them to care about the protection of American jobs. The Republican presidential debate in economically depressed Michigan last week showed that the top-tier Republican candidates are out of touch with the voters on economic issues. It was so disappointing that most of the Republican candidates offered nothing about the economy that touches the lives of middle-class Americans. And they are an enormous block of voters who joined with social conservatives to elect and re-elect Ronald Reagan. Let's be frank. The values voters who put the social issues at the top of their agenda are the largest bloc in the Republican Party, but they are not a majority. Reagan was elected with a coalition of social conservatives and working-class Americans who need good jobs and hope to live the American dream. On economics, most Republican presidential candidates just give us tired old platitudes. They talked about cutting spending, but most Americans don't believe they'll do that because Republicans did not cut spending when they had control of both Congress and the White House. The candidates talked about the line item veto, but that's irrelevant because it's unconstitutional. The candidates repeated the slogan, free trade. They had better wake up and face reality. The Wall Street Journal NBC poll reported that Republican voters, by a nearly 2-to-1 margin, now believe that free trade is bad for the U.S. economy because it costs jobs. Grassroots Republicans have reached this conclusion because so many of their friends have lost good manufacturing jobs and had to take jobs at a third the pay, and because the wives had to go to work to pay for the groceries and the mortgage. We want to hear the plan of our presidential candidate for dealing with the way foreign countries discriminate against U.S. producers and products by subsidies and tax rebates. The leading Republican presidential candidates in the Michigan debate just said we have to be more competitive with foreign producers. That's absurd. There's no way we can be competitive with Chinese factory workers who are paid 30 cents an hour with no benefits. One candidate suggested that better U.S. technology will enable us to compete. That's also absurd. The Chinese are stealing our technology and our inventions, and they still work their people at 30 cents an hour. Some suggested that better education with more math and science will make us competitive. That's absurd, too. Our college graduates cannot compete with Asian engineers and computer techies who work for $10,000 a year. The top-tier Republican presidential candidates showed little or no compassion for the millions of Americans who have lost their jobs to globalism. It's no wonder that the polls now show that Americans believe that Democrats are better at dealing with the economy than Republicans. Our candidate for president must reject the trade deals that are unfair to American workers. We want our president to protect us from the hostility of the World Trade Organization, a treaty that has been detrimental to America. The World Trade Organization has ruled against the United States in 40 out of 47 cases. Why is anybody surprised? Why do we put up with the globalists who put us into trade agreements and foreign organizations that are dominated by other countries that hate us and envy us? The latest outrage of the World Trade Organization is to rule that we must repeal our law against internet gambling because it violates free trade in recreational services. If we do not comply with this ruling, the World Trade Organization will assess billions of dollars in damages against us. There is no appeal from a World Trade Organization ruling or from the decision of any United Nations tribunal. We want to hear whether or not our presidential candidate supports a global economy which forces Americans to compete against pitifully low wages, slave labor, and discriminatory practices imposed by foreign countries and foreign tribunals. We want leadership to make sure that our economy produces good jobs that enable guys to buy a home and a car, support their families, live the American dream, and confidently expect their children to have an even better life. And sixth, we care about the protection of American sovereignty. We want our president to be a leader in protecting American sovereignty. We want him to reject United Nations treaties because they are always an invasion of our sovereignty. They all set up a monitoring commission to dictate U.S. domestic law, and most of them set up a tribunal of foreign judges to decide disputes and enforce their rulings. For example, we want our candidate to publicly oppose the United Nations Treaty on the Rights of the Child, which would dictate new rights of the child, such as access to any media of the child's choice despite his parents' objections. We want our presidential candidate to oppose the United Nations Treaty on Women, known as CEDAW, which would make abortion a treaty right and allow foreigners to revise our textbooks to comport with feminist ideology. We want our presidential candidate to oppose the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty, which would make all American use of the oceans and the minerals at the bottom of the seas subject to the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica and the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea in Germany. We want our presidential candidate to come right out and say, Ronald Reagan was right in opposing the treaty, and George W. Bush is wrong in cooperating with Democratic Senator Joe Biden in trying to get the Senate to ratify it. In all these UN treaty tribunals, the United States has only one vote out of 150 countries, the same vote as Communist Cuba. Based on past experience, we can assume they will regularly rule against us. Every United Nations treaty is a major loss of U.S. sovereignty. And we want our candidate for president to promise that the Security and Prosperity Partnership will not be a stepping stone to a North American Union modeled on the European Union. When Fox News asked President Bush about this at his Canadian News Conference in August, Bush refused to deny that his Security and Prosperity Partnership is the prelude to a North American Union. We expect our presidential candidate to announce that he will never allow the United States to be economically integrated with Mexico and Canada, and will not allow the free movement of labor across open borders. We want our candidate to support English as our official language. English is the primary factor that makes us what our national motto promises, e pluribus unum, out of many, one people. We must reject divisive talk about multiculturalism and diversity. We want to assimilate our legal immigrants into the American way of life, our language, and our culture. We want our presidential candidate to promise to rescind Bill Clinton's Executive Order 13166 that requires anyone who receives federal funds, such as doctors and hospitals, to provide services in any language of the applicant's choice. We want our presidential candidate to pledge to veto any bill that reduces the precious constitutional right of small inventors to ownership of their inventions. The right of inventors to own their own inventions is the only constitutional right mentioned in the Constitution before the amendments were added. Our unique and original constitutional system of assuring the property right of inventors is the reason why 95% of the world's inventions are American and the reason why we have achieved such economic prosperity. That constitutional right must be preserved. By coming here to this meeting, you've shown that you care about the future of our country and that you're willing to be activists and to carry on the project of transmitting our great and wonderful heritage to our children and grandchildren. We've been listening to the candidates, and we want to hear them make these promises. We want to know where they really stand and what they will do as president. Keep asking them and keep active, and do not be discouraged. They who wait upon the Lord will rise up with wings like eagles, and they will run and not be weary. May God be with you, and thank you for continuing in this battle.